Hello, everyone. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. It's great to have you here with us again for another episode of our weekly show where we're talking about issues of diversity and inclusion. We have a really fantastic show this week. So without any delay, let me bring in my friend and colleague, our Director of Learning and Inclusion, Jean Marie Navetta.
Hello, Liz Owen.
Hello, Jean Marie Navetta. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm coming off of my Thanksgiving binge, for which I have absolutely zero apologies.
Nor should you have any.
No, I did meet my goal of eating my body weight in carbohydrates. It really happened.
I'm a little jealous.
But I'm still here to tell mostly. So before we get started, I wanted to do a super quick preview of next week because we wanted to make sure that people knew it was coming up. So Liz, you have all the details on this one, and I think it's going to be a very interesting show.
Yeah, next week. I mean, today is going to be a huge show, and I'm super excited for Dr. Harmon to join us momentarily. I see him here in the green room. Next week, we are going to be tackling a subject that a lot of our chapters and many people across the country are seeing regarding the banning of books, particularly books with LGBTQ plus content. And we have three really incredible guests. Deborah Caldwell-Stone, who's the director of the ALA, the American Library Association Office for Intellectual Freedom. Maya Kobabe, who is the author of the book Gender Queer, which has been the subject in the center of a firestorm of, I believe, unnecessary controversy. And then author Melinda Lowe, who's the author of Last Night at the Telegraph Club. It's going to be a really incredible episode, I know. So I hope folks will come back to join us next week.
Awesome.
Yeah, so without any further ado, I'm going to hop off and let you get to this.
Thank you for the preview, Liz, and we'll see you later.
You bet.
Hey everybody, welcome again to our show. Every single week we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And this week we are talking healthcare, and I'm especially excited about this conversation because this is one of those topics that quite literally affects every last one of us. And when you want to talk about healthcare, your life kind of doesn't get any better than when you actually have the president of the American Medical Association, who is our guest this week. So I would like to introduce Dr. Gerald Harmon, the president of the AMA. Hi, Dr. Harmon.
Hey, how are you today? Thanks for letting me join
me. Great. How are you?
Oh, I'm better than I deserve. Thank you.
I like that answer. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I have to tell you, I was reading your article about words matter and it's time to get them right. And it got me so excited because we spend so much time at PFLAG talking about how we communicate with people. And I want to talk about that article, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention a little bit about yesterday. So yesterday was the commemoration of World AIDS Day. It's been about 40 years since the New York Times made that first report and actually mentioned that there was something going on. And during that time, about 35 million people have died from the disease worldwide. But meanwhile, a lot of people, I think, sometimes think it's kind of a done conversation. So could you just very briefly tell people, where are we with treatment and care? Have things improved incredibly? Are there things people should still be concerned about?
Well, very good question. And you're right. We still have an AIDS epidemic, an HIV epidemic. There's no question of it. We have over 1 million people in the United States who have HIV. And the scary thing is about 13% of them don't even know they have it. And so that's a real risk factor for public health. And remember the AMA's mission, and I'll remind you, it's ingrained to me. We're to advance the art and science of medicine and the betterment of public health. And that betterment of public health, and I've got 13% of the folks of the 1.2 million who have HIV disease and don't even know it, and they can't avail themselves of early treatment. That's an issue, a public health urgency.
Thank you. You know, it's really interesting that you say that. I live in Palm Springs, California, and my doctor, the first time I visited, actually said to me, we would like to do an HIV test. And I said, well, there's really probably no risk factors for me. And they said, but we are trying to get everybody tested. And when you say that, it makes me realize why that program exists. So thank you for giving me some really great context. So I want to talk about the article that you wrote, and I want to talk about some of the stuff happening at the AMA. So the AMA has been really incredibly vocal on the issues of equity and health care in probably bigger ways than it ever has been before. I mean, your article even acknowledges people didn't always get it right. So what was the inspiration behind this work? Was it patients? Was it providers? And where's that momentum coming from?
Well, the momentum for health equity, advancing health equity for all, that led to our publication of our document this past May, the AMA's Guide for Advancing Health Equity and Addressing Racial Disparity. It actually began over the past decade. It wasn't just all of a sudden birthed because of the COVID pandemic or other issues. The timing was fortuitous that we do have an obvious awareness of health disparities and outcomes in the COVID pandemic among many underserved and minoritized populations, including HIV positive and at-risk individuals, LGBTQ plus population. All of those are affected disproportionately by the the COVID pandemic, no question of it. But in 2017, I was chairman of the board of the American Medical Association. I've been elected by my peers. Real honored to be that. The House of Delegates and the AMA board had recognized health disparity and the lack of health equity in many venues. And I formed a task force with strong urging and basis among the House of Delegates. I formed a task force to advance health equity, to address the issues, to give us some facts, give us a report back a year later. A year later, they came back to us, had several recommendations that were consistent with the House policy. We decided then to form a center for health equity in the AMA, within the AMA itself. We were able to recruit away from New York City, Dr. Aletha Maybank, a distinguished pediatrician, public health expert. Dr. Maybank and her team worked vigorously and tirelessly, and we found their team helped us present and package a health equity report that we talked about that we released in May. So we're really excited about that. It's been a very attention-getting report. It's garnished substantial praise from many venues. It's had some criticisms, both positive and negative, that say, "Hey, we've gone too far." Perhaps it's a thought-provoking document. We've had some that said, "Hey, you didn't go far enough. Where's the more to this?" So it clearly is important to us to advance health equity, and our plan, a strategic plan with some measurable expectations, some metrics in there, some accountabilities, we feel is the way to move forward and move the needle forward at advancing health equity among many populations, including our LGBTQ plus population.
Thank you. And as you were talking, I actually thought of a question that sort of popped into my head. Do you think that this kind of guide and this work will also influence the way students are being trained in medical schools? Because we know that how you are taught definitely influences the way you approach your work. Do you think that this will have an influence on that side? So we are bringing in more providers out of school who are a little bit more, I think, culturally competent ready.
Jean Marie, there absolutely. That's one of our targets metric. That's one of our expectations, that we improve the diversity of the healthcare workforce, that we increase the diversity of healthcare education and health equity education among medical students. We need to train these young doctors in training up front so they understand and appreciate that health disparities exist. It's not something that we have deliberately thrown under the rug or hidden, but it's something that is not always necessarily forefront in the front of our medical education process. We're really good, and I'm a product of the public medical education system, although it was admittedly in the latter part of the last century, as evidenced by gray thinning hair, and the wrinkles on my skin. But these are educated lines. These are lines of experience. And I will tell you that we were taught basic science, we were taught chemistry, then we were taught clinical science, but we weren't really focused on health equity at the time. We thought we were, but what we didn't know, we didn't know. So that's important that our provider workforce not only have more diversity in itself, but also that our educational system has more awareness that healthcare disparities exist, that health equity needs to be advanced. And this is a perfect document to help move that needle forward.
Thank you. Thank you. I found it so fascinating, even some of the pieces that you talked about in your article, the very basic language that we are using to address people, the way we talk about different populations. I don't think people at first blush realize what an influence that can have on how a patient responds to a provider. And so I was just so grateful, because I think you're right. It wasn't that people didn't want to address it. It's you don't know what you don't know until someone tells you.
You're right, and I'll admit to having been very, again, I've had a lot of formal education, a lot of experiential education, a lot of learning, but a lot of this made me really do self-introspective thought processes. It made me aware that I wasn't aware that my language might have been disparaging, might have closed down a two-way translatable conversation between myself and my patients. I didn't mean to be offensive with my language. I didn't know, so I had to educate myself. Without an awareness of this, we can continue to reduce communication. We might put up barriers, although we don't think we are, between ourselves and a fragile patient or person who is really seeking our care, but is for some reason not able to translate or transmit their concerns to me as a provider, because I don't know the questions I should be asking and the platitudes perhaps that I should be avoiding, the standard documentation, the languages. And it's as simple. And these language suggestions that we did with our language guide that we've released along with the AAMC, subsequent to our health equity task force plan, it has some very thoughtful adjective to think about, that we no longer say the 37-year-old diabetic in room 2 or the 28-year-old epileptic in the lobby. We think about the 37-year-old person with diabetes, the 24-year-old with a seizure disorder. And these connotations, this language matters so much, and the reception our patients will bring to us and garner for us when we address them as individuals.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. And as somebody who is gay, I can tell you sometimes I have felt intimidated in situations in disclosing information. The example that I always give to people is how many doctors have spoken to me and said, "Oh, are you pregnant?" And I say no. And they say, "Could you be pregnant?" And I say, "There's literally no chance that I am." And the assumption that I might not be telling the truth, but the real reason is I do not have sex with men. So that would be the reason. So it shuts down the conversation, and it's intimidating. Sometimes you don't want to provide that information.
Well, we have statistics. We have our own studies that validate your experience. You're exactly right. The AMA has done statistics and done some analyses of this, and as many as 34% of patients report being offended or maybe being judged perhaps by the provider, and so they were hesitant to bring out their gender situation, their what they considered to be personal information, but necessary to share with their providers. And when you think that 34% have been offended or felt disrespected, as it were, and then to some degree, as many as 19% may have tried to change the patient inappropriately. We've got to educate these doctors. We're here to advance public health. We need to be absolutely not just non-racist, non-discriminatory. We need to be proactive so we can introduce uncomfortable conversations in the presence of our patients, and they feel more comfortable sharing their experiences and giving us a better basis upon which to make medical decisions.
Music to my ears, Dr. Harmon. This is such good news. Thank you. I love hearing this because I think this does have that immediate impact. So one of the really big developments from the AMA in 2020 was actually identifying racism as a public health threat. It really interestingly enough, yesterday when President Biden was talking about World AIDS Day, he actually mentioned racism as public health threat too. So I thought this was such an interesting reflection of what the AMA has been doing. So could you tell us a little bit about what were the factors that made this statement happen? And how do you explain this to people? Because I think a lot of people don't quite understand the connection between racism and impact on health.
Very good question. The Board of Trustees actually made that statement last year, and we decided to make that part of our mission, not so much our mission statement, but a mission of our focus. The representative reflected the House of Delegates policy that they had passed, and we as the board wanted to make sure we respected that and put that in front of folks, that we identified racism as a public health urgency, police brutality against persons of color inappropriately was a public health emergency. And the reason we could do this is that the science tells us that persons of color with gender dysphoria and issues are concerned because their outcomes, their healthcare results are less are actually getting worse every year. So we're having worse outcomes among those at risk every year. And unless we're going to start doing something now, the gap is going to widen, and we're not going to move the needle on advancing health equity and ending these health disparities. So it's a public health issue for us. We want to make sure everybody understands that. AMA is, we're 176 years old. We're supposed to be for advancing the betterment of public health for all Americans, and that's everybody, regardless of racial designation, gender designation, all the issues that that lend themselves to healthcare disparity right now.
Thank you. Thank you. The New York Times had an article on Sunday, and it was about maternal mortality among Black women in the United States, and the numbers were absolutely outrageous. So I think these pieces are starting to come together.
Well, we see that, and we see the life expectancy over the last couple of years, even before we had the COVID pandemic, we had a decreasing life expectancy for Americans. For the first time in a long time, Americans weren't living as long as they had been in previous generations. They had actually reduced life expectancies by about a year for Americans, on average, about 1.2 years. However, the disparities were more disproportionate among persons of color than among white Americans, which is really telling. You would think that if we're going to have a reduction in life expectancy, it would be universal across all persons of color, regardless of race or even gender. But no, there was a disproportionate where actually Latinx individuals lost almost 3 years of life expectancy. Black Americans lost 2 years, and white Americans lost only 1 year of life expectancy.
Wow.
So that's a disparity that we really have to look at with a very fine lens and figure out how we're going to change that and improve the public health for all Americans. It can be an overwhelming thought process. So you have to take incremental positive steps, and you have to start that journey of 1,000 miles with several steps, accountable steps, review your progress periodically, and make adjustments as necessary.
Thank you. And I think the data that you are producing is so incredibly helpful in this conversation. So we're not speaking anecdotally, because when you hear numbers like that, it does give somebody pause. So one of the other things that obviously with PFLAG, we definitely want to get into is talking about healthcare and people who are LGBTQ identified. The AMA has also been pretty aggressively vocal about inclusion for LGBTQ people. But could you talk a little bit about some of the efforts to improve care for LGBTQs, particularly at a time where we are seeing state legislatures introduce bills? So, for example, the one in Arkansas that actually legislate what the relationship between provider and patient look like.
You know, that's so discouraging for us at the AMA and for leaders and for many American physicians. You're right. The legislatures have limited access to gender specific care among their states, and they put LGBTQ plus identifying individuals at risk for their health care. We have evidence that many insurance companies and with the backup of the various state legislators are not providing gender specific care, hormonal therapy for LGBTQ individuals that need to have that hormonal therapy to support their gender identity health. And it's scary that this is being allowed to happen in the 21st century in America, that this is moving backwards for healthcare of all and increasing healthcare disparities and really giving us some bad outcomes. You mentioned also the data. The problem we've also had is a lack of identifying data for LGBTQ plus individuals. Because we have perhaps been a little bit agnostic and not wanting to ask or not wanting to accept the gender identity of our patients, maybe at the provider level, we don't have data yet. So we need to open up data. The AMA sponsored a lot of fellowships. We've actually had at the University of Wisconsin, I'll bring out them by name. We've given them a fellowship and award to do some more data definition and come back to us with some peer-reviewed evidence of how we can improve the healthcare access for LGBTQ individuals under the documented peer review system. So it's not just anecdotal, it becomes scientific.
First, thank you for conceding that point and talking about the lack of data. It's one of the points of frustration that we often find. I was actually doing some research this morning looking for something specifically in LGBTQ healthcare, and I simply could not find the numbers. And it always reminds me that we've got a lot of work to do in just generating those numbers. A follow-up question about some of the interference with state legislatures. If you were speaking to somebody who is, let's say, a parent of someone who is trans identified, who is living in one of these states where they are facing these things or where they actually are in effect now, what would you suggest to them? Because it has to be pretty scary to quite literally not be able to get care based on the way the law has changed around you.
Well, it is scary. I cannot imagine. One of the things I learned as a doctor, and I tell all medical students and doctors in training, never tell somebody how they feel. You need to be empathetic without being falsely empathetic. Their lived experience is their lived experience. So they have their own experience. They have their own lens. Well, we need to be as providers as empathetic to voice and share and really live that empathy for them. But it is very difficult now. We have to, if you're a parent of a child that has a different gender identity than their biologically might have been assigned to them, you're worried about their health care, because if their doctor tries to help them with gender supporting treatment and their state and legislature, their insurance company denies them care, they're already stressed enough. For goodness sake, think about the emotional stress for this young individual who's dealing and grappling with societal judgment of them, and they're wondering about this dysphoria. Are they a problem, or they really are? They're trying to be true to their identity, which is not always assigned appropriately at birth. We've had conversations about gender designation on the birth certificates, on the public release form. We've had definitions about that and suggested movements in that direction. So these youngsters are already, if you're the parent, you're already worried about your child. I know that's challenging. Talk to your doctor, find that sympathetic doctor, get some advice from them. We try to make that information available on our public website as well as our professional website. We'll make our sincere efforts at introducing appropriate model legislation to your respective legislation, understanding that healthcare quality is our guiding compass. It's not to judge the morals of the legislature or the legislators involved, but to make them aware that the science says this is the right way to go for the benefit of public health with your individual patient. We may have to try to pick them off one at a time, but we're going to continue our path forward to ensure appropriate care for all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for saying that. And it's really good to know that, because I think this is a time of tremendous fear and justifiable fear from a lot of these families. We hear from so many of them who quite literally feel there's nowhere to turn, because, I mean, being able to leave your state to get care is a privilege, which many people do not have the funds to do.
Yeah, and as you point out, it disproportionately affects those who are of lower income, who are already struggling with basic food needs, life sustaining needs. They may live in what we would consider to be a food desert, where they don't have limited options. They can't always go on the internet and have home delivery. They can't afford that. So these folks our patients are already concerned about their day-to-day health, and then we throw this on top of them with the behavioral health concerns that we're stressing them even more. It really puts all of our patients, but particularly our gender dysphoric patients, at risk who don't have any supporting infrastructure available for them. That's why we're trying to educate physicians too, that this is a real crisis. This is a real public health crisis. We have an ethical obligation to provide care for our patients, and we need to know that care is needed, and then we need to know ways to make it better.
Thank you, by the way, for mentioning some of the other issues that intersect with this topic. For example, food insecurity. A lot of people don't realize it is a significant problem in the LGBTQ population, but many people don't see that, and that directly ties into public health.
Well, and the other thing too, and if our patients, if an LGBTQ individual is concerned about approaching a doctor because they've been either treated rudely, inappropriately, judged perhaps, they felt that they're not received properly, then they're going to delay care. They're going to delay care. And we know the science tells us the earlier we put folks on appropriate medications, the sooner we can minimize that HIV viral load and put them in a healthier situation. I mean, this is an urgent situation. We know that we need to get appropriate affirming care for a LGBTQ or HIV positive individual population. We need to get it sooner rather than later. We need to have an awareness. We need to get an acceptance, and then we need to get funding for it, and a recognition that there are behavioral health issues with these folks, such as substance use disorder, that puts them at risk too. So there are all manners of leverage we can bring to bear to improve the health of this population.
Yes, thank you. It's really refreshing to hear this, and especially these acknowledging how many people do in fact delay care. There's research on it, and it's often because they have had bad experiences in the past. So, PFLAGers, if nothing else, we are many things, but one of those big things is focused on how do we make things better. So, I would love to know from you, Dr. Harmon. If you are somebody who is visiting your healthcare provider and that person perhaps uses language that is not inclusive, or they say something that perhaps is not necessarily accurate when we're talking about LGBTQ issues, I think a lot of people's inclination would be to just ditch the provider and find a new one. But I do think conversations matter. If you were talking to somebody who said, this happened to me, what would you suggest that they do? How should that conversation with the provider sound?
Well, here's the deal. That's a very good question. And one of the AMA is trying to do, and I'm, as a president, I'm glad to be a spokesperson, honored to be a spokesperson for this. Words do matter. We're trying to educate our healthcare providers. We're not trying to be language police. That's a distraction. If we're addressed with our health equity documents, with our language documents, and saying you're trying to burn books, you're trying to prevent this or to change history. We're not trying to be revisionist. What we're trying to do is bring the words to bear that we think will open up a better conversation between the patient and the physician and improve that dialogue, improve that trust, which is the hallmark of what makes us a doctor. People trust us. I've got a pin that I wear every now and then that says, trust me, I'm a doctor. I believe that. You should trust me as a doctor, but I need to earn that trust, not just hang my shingles on the board or the wall and have all these degrees after my name. You need to know that I practice peer-reviewed evidence, that I practice in your best interest as my patient. And that needs to be a valid, sacrosanct relationship. But we need to make sure the providers know that their language means things. You need to understand, too, that you as a patient have chosen a physician probably because of a good relationship or a good, if not a good relation, at least a good recommendation. Someone said, hey, that's a good doctor. Go see Dr. Harmon. He's a smart, safe doctor. And then you find that he may have some words that he's not quite expressing that make you feel supportive or comfortable. I think in today's world, we need to feel comfortable and say, excuse me, Dr. Harmon, I prefer that you refer to me by my recognized gender identity and not just assume that because I may have a or more masculine phenotype that you're using the pronoun him or he. I prefer she. Just be honest about your gender identity. Talk to them and say, try to educate them without correcting them. And I think if you help put that physician more at ease, believe it or not, I think he or she will be more at ease with you too. I think number one, they'll respect your integrity and your honesty. They didn't mean to. Again, we don't know sometimes as poorly, not so much poorly, but not currently educated physicians that we're stepping on someone's toes or impeding that relationship of trust. I know it may sound a little bit simple, but sometimes just use the right words. Say, hey, with all due respect, could you consider this? If I'm ever corrected in that way, I think I have enough of a comfort level with accepting my inadequacies and moving forward and becoming educated.
Thank you. Thank you. And so are there any resources that you would suggest that people look at? I mean, I certainly went through the guide or the publications that were up and associated with with the article that we used this week. But are there any other things that you would suggest that maybe people point their providers to? Because there's some really great content up there on the AMA site.
Well, the AMA does this, and it's not just for AMA members, it's for all physicians and for all clinicians. And it's not just clinicians, it's people who want to learn more about these public issues that we have brought to the forefront. We might, with all due respect, we may get you to register on the website so we know who you are, but you don't have to pay dues to be an AMA member. They're available at no charge. It's about education. We try to be a continuous learning organization. One of our strategic arcs is to advance education opportunities and provide the workforce that we need, not only for the past, but for the present and the future. So we try to educate all physicians and healthcare providers about it. And there are a number of modules. In today's world, you can go on the internet. I know we have limitations if we live in some parts of rural South Carolina where I live in, they don't have broadband, don't have cell service. But if you can get to the library, if you get to somewhere, get to our AMA website, educate yourself about it, help your doctor educate it. My patients come in all the time to me saying, hey, doc, have you read this article? Well, I don't have time to read it then, but I'll take their advice. I mean, if they're looking at it, then I've got a way to improve my relationship with them. At least they know that I'm not turning a deaf ear to them. And I think you'll find that your physician is going to be more than receptive, especially in today's world, to getting better educated. It's the right thing to do.
I have to put my own plug in. My favorite email of every afternoon is my daily update from the Journal of the American Medical Association. It is the best quick read. I don't necessarily understand every article, but I am always so grateful for that information. I have learned so much from it since I've been subscribing. So let me put my plug in for that. We are at time, Dr. Harmon, but I want to thank you so very much for joining us and giving us your time and most of all for the work that you are leading at the AMA. It is quite literally changing and saving lives. So thank you so
Jean
much.
Marie, it's a privilege and honor, and for such a time as this, that's why I'm here. I just cannot imagine a more timely opportunity to be a doctor in America today than right now. So thank you for having me. Thank you for taking my message.
Thank you, Dr. Harmon. Well, that brings us to the end of yet another show. As Liz said, definitely you want to be with us next week for another fantastic one. If you have not looked at the AMA's resources, I encourage you to check those out sometime today. Keep it fresh in your mind. And until next week, we will end the way we always end, which is to remind you to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. And please, 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 if you haven't been vaccinated, go get vaccinated. And if you haven't gotten your booster yet, go get your booster. I got mine. It's all good. Let's get through this together. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I will see you next week. If you need any help before then, please visit us at pflag.org. Bye, everybody.